Okay, we are live now. We'll just wait for a few seconds. Let's see anybody joining in. Okay, yeah. Sure. I hope everything's working. All the technical, we can hear you. You can hear me.
Yes.
Last final call.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, let's start then. Okay, my name is Dawa from Tibetan Community in Britain, and we are so privileged and honored to host this panel discussion. And I would like to welcome you all and say Tashi Delek, all the panelists.
Tashi Delek.
And I would also like to welcome all our audience, our TCB members, and all the friends watching from far and wide. And please remember to put your questions. There will be Q&A sessions after the discussion. And please share this event to all your friends, far and wide. Make this event more known. So as we all know that China has caused this huge human disaster, I believe it's simply because of the Chinese authorities' negligence, lies, and cover up. And this lethal coronavirus, or I should say this lethal CCP virus pandemic, will reshape our world. So as a Tibetan, we feel it's very important for us to energize ourselves and to be part of this trend and narrate our own stories. So that's how we feel as a Tibetan, to be part of this trend. So the topic for our discussion is Tibet in the context of global pandemic, new development and trends. And I'm delighted to introduce our moderator for the session. It's Kate Saunders. Kate is a Tibet specialist, writer, journalist, and she has worked for many Tibet-related NGOs. And her current work was as a research director for ICT. And she's author of 18 Layers of Hell, the stories from gulags in China. And she has also done numerous reporting in publications like Washington Post, Guardian, and Times. And she's a long-time friend of Tibet. So I will pass it to Kate. Kate, now you can take it over the session.
Thank you very much, Dawa. Thank you for the Tibetan Community UK for inviting us to do this discussion, which I hope will be the first of a series of discussions. We only have 1 hour, and I hope that there will be many questions and some good discussion. The format we're going to have is that each of our 3 expert speakers is going to give a short rundown, around 10 minutes, of issues that they've been looking at and researching. And after that, we're going to open up to questions. So I'm going to give brief introductions to our three very eminent, esteemed speakers. We're going to start off with Katja Buffetwell, who is a scholar who has spent many years, something like 20, 25 years, going back and forth on the plateau, knows it more than almost any Western scholar, after long experience of travel, of pilgrimage, of research, writing on Tibet. And Katja is an anthropologist, a Tibetologist, working in Paris. And her work focuses mainly on Tibetan rituals, their changes within the PRC, as well as cultural policies too. She's published numerous articles and books. And her last publication is L'Âge d'Or du Tibet, and that's published in Paris last year. So far not an English translation, but I hope that there will be. I will actually, rather than introducing our next speaker, Katja, maybe you could take over now and just speak for a little while about the coronavirus pandemic in Tibet and how it's affecting Tibet, what we know about the impact on the ground.
Thanks, Kate, and thanks to all of you for the organization of this panel. So, yes, I was looking for information about COVID in Tibet, I mean TIR, but also Kam and Amdo, in the frame of an article I wanted to write for a journal, which I did. And so the first things we learn is that it's very, very difficult to have information. So you have two kinds of sources. One, of course, it's the Western sources, but in that case, I didn't find anything after 26th of February, and it's also very not complete at all. But you have another kind of sources, which are the official one. In that case, they are better because it's every day. But here too, it's imprecise and incomplete because they give some, if you go, for instance, in Sichuan, you can have some place where the demography is mainly Tibetan. But the problem is you have the number of people who are sick. For instance, in Tao, we know that Tao and the Ganse prefecture, it's where we had the maximum cases, but you don't know if it's Tibetan who are sick. We know that you have a lot of Chinese also. What we know, for instance, we know that in Lhasa, we had one case, and this case was a Chinese one. And in the official sources, they make a distinction between TIR and Lhasa. So they say that you have another case in TIR, but is it a Chinese? Is it a Tibetan? We don't know. So the things which, if we keep in mind that the sources are imprecise, incomplete, what struck us is that the number is very low, because I found altogether, not knowing if it's Tibetan or if it's Chinese, 141 people sick, which even if we say we have to think it's 4 times more or 5 times more, still it's not a lot. And as dead people, I found 2 Tibetan, and these 2 Tibetan belong to the party. And so the sources, the Chinese sources, explain that it's people who fought a lot against the COVID and they die, and they have to receive a special medal reward. So what I think is important to note, it's even if we don't know the number, it's not a very high number in comparison with what we know in Europe, for instance. But I suppose you saw that you have some articles about the fact that maybe in high altitude people are less concerned with this virus. And I call to have real information. I called some friend in Tibet, in Gyaltang area, Dechen. There they had no one case, no one. And I call also friends in Nepal to know if in Mustang, Dolpo, Khumbu, and it seems that you have no case either. So maybe there is something which protects them in this area. So you have also to know that of course, the Chinese use this COVID as a propaganda. And for instance, they were doing a lot of advertising about a young nurse who was going in Wuhan to be in front line and to help the people. And in fact, according to the information from Radio Free Asia, this lady had no choice, but she was sent there. So it's about what we know. If you make a summary, we know also that when the flight were stopped the 22nd of January, during 1 or 2 days, the flight to Urumqi and Lhasa were still operating. So this we can be sure, because you had, I don't know how you say in English, sorry, capture d'écran. You know, people took pictures in the airport too. So we have proof of that. So what I wanted to say, just about the COVID. If we speak only about COVID, it's all what I know and what I could discover in the sources. And the last thing I want to tell, it's during this time, the Chinese authority are working very hard to put more repressive law and also to attack the language, mainly in Amdo, in Ngawa. And it's very important because in Amdo, it's where the Tibetan language was the most well preserved. So it's a very, very bad news to learn that in Ngawa now you have the teaching is in Chinese. They want to make teaching in Chinese only. So I stop because my time is finished.
Well, we can follow up on. We can maybe follow up on some of those points, Katja, as we go along. I mean, maybe just to pick up on one of those points, you were saying that COVID has enabled the Chinese authorities to expand its reach and to tighten restrictions still further. And do you see anything in the religious sphere happening, in sense, religious, cultural sphere, anything else in terms of under the cover of the coronavirus?
You mean, sorry, the sound is very bad. You mean if I see something more repressive during this time? It's what you speak about.
Yes, anything more in the cultural religious sphere that you were thinking of?
Because yes, yeah. We saw, well, as you must know, it's you had a lot of Tibetans who were arrested under the pretext that they were spreading rumors about the sickness. You had a lot of discussion places like WeChat, which were closed in Lhasa, but also in Chiang Rai. You had a lot of new law. And you have also something which appear very dangerous. It's in the area of Dingri. And now the authorities, they were looking in Tibetan people who had family in Nepal or India, which is very frightening because, as you know, a lot of Tibetan in the TIA, they have family outside. And so they had a lot of problem like that. But for me, what is really frightening, it's at the time where most of the world is counting the dead, and it's a really terrible time. And you see the country where the virus came from, and the authorities, they are just working to make more and more repression. So it's really frightening, I think. And it's also a time for them very easy to use to pass very strict law, because of course a lot of people are looking not in this direction because they have so many things to think and work about right now. So I think yes, it's all the surveillance. Sorry, I don't find my English word. All the camera, all this network to look at the people is more and more. They're more and more stronger, and instead, I think of looking what is happening with the market where they sell all these wildlife, animals, which it's not allowed even for Chinese. They prefer to spend their time looking at what is doing Tibetan, like if they have a picture of the Dalai Lama or something like that. So it's very frightening right now, yes.
Okay, so I think we'll thank you for that. So they've really expanded their reach in all sorts of ways under the cover of this virus. So I think that leads us, and of course had an opportunity to trial and test out this system of total surveillance, and also the mass mobilization of hundreds of thousands of party cadres that have been operational in Tibet since around 2011. So I think we'll ask Gabriel to tell us a little bit more about that. And Gabriel Lafitte, who many of you know, is a writer focused on Tibetan modernity, China's plans for Tibet, urbanization, industrialization of traditional Tibetan economy, biodiversity, nature across Tibet, rivers and hydro dams, and also the genetic uniqueness of the Tibetans. And I'm sure that everybody watching this may well be aware of Gabriel's blog, which is ruckaw.org. And I strongly advise any of you, all of you, to look at this blog. There's some really fascinating posts that Gabriel has put up recently about the coronavirus in Tibet. Gabriel is really doing work that no one else is doing right now in terms of drawing connections, making connections, and analysing some of the deeper undercurrents of policy in Tibet. So, and also has worked with Tibetans for 40 years, long-time friend of Tibet, including regular training for Tibetan monitors, researchers, and others across the world and in Dharamsala. So, Gabriel, please, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
One of the things Katya said was that Tibetans are frightened, and I'd like to pick up on that and explore that a little bit further. I think Katya is quite right, and she has given us a very quick summary of all of the places in Tibet where infections have occurred. There have also been infections in Tsering, in the main city of Kanlo, Ganan, in southern Gansu. But what does that mean in the lives of Tibetans who find themselves on the front line and yet at the same time demobilized, shut down, locked down, shut out of making a living, out of earning something, while at the same time knowing that they are powerless to do anything about migrants coming in from Wuhan to Tibet. And, Tibetans know that although China has a very strict household registration system, the hukou, they have actually been very flexible when it comes to lowland Chinese, Han Chinese, who want to go to Tibet, whether it's for the long term or just in the short term to make money and to send the money as a remittance back to their family in their home provinces in China. And Tibetans have no power to stop them, to interrogate them, to test them, to check them. And Wuhan, the center of the whole outbreak, is, although it's physically a long way from Tibet, has very strong connections with Tibet, both eastern Tibet, Kham, where Katya gave us several examples of some very difficult situations, eastern Tibet and Wuhan are joined, connected by the Yangtze River. Wuhan is a major intellectual center, corporate center, research center, And when Chinese geologists go to quite remote areas in Tibet looking for minerals, looking for commodities, looking for something that China can exploit to make Tibet pay its way, pay for the very expensive Chinese administration, those geologists are very often from Wuhan, because Wuhan is a major center of Earth Science Institute research. So you quite regularly have scientists from Wuhan in very remote areas of Tibet as engineers looking for suitable sites for hydro dams or looking for minerals. And the irony, I think, of all of this, and this is coming back to Dawa's introduction, where he said, you know, we need to energize our discussion. And I think that's a very good point. I think one way that we can energize all of this is by recognizing that there's a much wider picture here. There are, in fact, many echoes that come back to our own Western societies. I'm in Australia, Martin in Prague, Katya in Paris, the others in London. All of us live in societies where governments have taken their cue to take new powers to themselves, which they may or may not wish to surrender even after this pandemic is over. But one other way of widening the discussion is to look at the Tibetan historical experience of plague, of pandemic, of infection. China historically has always felt threatened by the barbarians of the north and the west. And part of that sense of threat is that they bring the plague. They are the carriers who bring the plague into China. And Tibet historically has had a very specific part in that, because Chinese scientists constantly remind Chinese audiences that the bacteria that caused the classic plague that killed a third of the population of Europe many centuries ago resides in the native population of small burrowing rodents in the grasslands of Tibet, and it's there simply as part of the landscape. And if we ask ourselves, why did China insist on massive campaigns to poison and eradicate those rodents and getting considerable international monetary and technical assistance from European governments to do so? You know, partly it's their official argument is that it's all to do with the burrowing of the rodents, and this somehow causes land degradation when actually they aerate the soil and are keystone species. But, you know, let's not go into that. The other fear is that, you know, they are the source of the plague. So the irony is that while China sees the plague as coming from Tibet, this plague has gone to Tibet, and yet there's very little recognition that the Tibetans have been vulnerable, they have been fearful, they have been, above all else, powerless to even question people on a bus coming to Lhasa, coming, as Katya said, to quite remote areas of Tibet. Katya mentioned Dawu in Kham, in Kansai prefecture. You know, this is really quite a remote area. How is it possible that there were, you know, 100, maybe 200 infections in such a remote area? So Tibetans are used to lockdown. They are used to being isolated and separated. They are used to being under intensive surveillance. And in some way, we could actually go so far as to say that while the virus spread into Tibet, something new that is now familiar to all of us has in turn spread from Tibet, not only right across China, but also right across the whole world, and that is the technologies of surveillance and lockdown. And these are technologies that China trialed, tested, experimented with, developed new technologies since the earliest years of this century, and gradually put together a very sophisticated program to isolate and lock down Tibetans, and then exported it to Xinjiang, then exported it because of the coronavirus to the whole of China, and the rest of the world is now in many ways with different variations adopting similar models of a strong state with a strong capacity to scrutinize every citizen, make every citizen legible, visible to the state, so that all states now know who you are, where you live, who you've been with, who you've talked to, who you've had contact with, and we are now left, even if the virus passes, wondering how much longer will that last? Will these new powers of the newly strengthened state persist, or will they fade away? So these are questions that are relevant to all of us, and I think all of us need to ask them.
Thank you, Gabriel. That was a really thought-provoking, and I'm sure we're going to have some more questions on that. We just had a question which was to, your website is ruckle.org, so just someone has asked for that address again, because what you were saying was very interesting. I'm going to ask Martin to speak now briefly. Martin has served as Minister of the Environment in Prague for the Czech government. He's also former chairman of the Green Party in the Czech Republic. During the Velvet Revolution in November 1989, Martin was one of the founders of the Civic Forum. And now with his wife, Katerina, a former parliamentarian who is active in the Tibet group in the Czech Parliament, and I believe the current Tibet group in the Czech Parliament is the biggest in Europe, which is testimony to the work of Martin and Katerina there in Prague. So Martin has been active in work on Tibet ever since traveling to Tibet in the 1980s. So a long-time friend of Tibet and also of His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. And Martin, I wonder, Martin, as an expert on the environment and someone who has spoken at numerous climate change functions and meetings, forums in the world, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about Tibet's environment more generally. We know that it's an epicenter of global climate change. We know that there are massive transformations happening on the Tibetan plateau, and that the Chinese policies are literally reshaping the Tibetan landscape. And I wonder also, Martin, given that you understand the machinations of power politics almost more than anybody I know, if you could perhaps look into the future a little bit and talk about how you think this coronavirus pandemic may affect the world's view of China and how Tibet might fit into that story.
Great.
No pressure there, Martin.
Yeah, it's now I'm on. Very good questions, Kate. Thank you very much for putting them. I'm trying to follow the story of coronavirus with respect of the role of People's Republic of China in a world policy of combating climate change. You know that by the time Trump withdrew out of a Paris agreement, that China sort of filled the gap, and there's been a big question about the role of China, because if we look on a global CO2 emissions, in 2018 they were a little bit higher increased, and it was mostly entirely due to China, because the rest of the world, European Union, United States, reduced use of coal, and even India increased very modestly. So mainly due to China, the emissions has raised, and at the same time, China is the largest polluter in the world. And so the question is about what the coronavirus is going to do with the position of China with respect to, until the coronavirus, the global issue number one, now prevailed for a certain period by this coronavirus issue. What is interesting for me is that the International Energy Agency recently published their estimation what coronavirus, in fact, what the enforced lockdown caused, and they are expecting 8% CO2 emission fall this year, which is about 2.6 megatons of CO2. And this is the first year we are on the track to meet 1.5 degrees centigrade target, because it should be 7.6% every year. We are now at 8. So just to imagine what we have to do every year when it is compared to what coronavirus did to the global economy, how difficult it is. And with respect to China, the coronavirus reduced the CO2 emissions temporarily by about a quarter. But now the reports are saying that they are returning to normal. And what I read is that China Electricity Council, as well as State Grid Operator, they are lobbying for targets that they allow hundreds of new coal power plants. I read the translation of this document. They launched the so-called traffic light system. They want to make the permitting process easier, and this could happen in 2023. And so that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is that Chinese climate goals target means that they should peak the emissions by 2030, which means that all new energy installations should be low carbon. So this is a complete different policy. And so for me, first question is, if based on this behavior of China, how they and their strategy, how to run up the economy again based on coal, that this will highly probably undermine their effort to be a climate leader. So I'm expecting China to be much weaker player with respect to climate change. And then the implication of COVID, I think the second issue, which is we see that, or from my perspective, the priority of the foreign policy of People's Republic of China is to legitimize the communist totalitarian regime. So whatever they do, wherever they invest, they are enforcing their influence. The main interest of them is to legitimize their system so that they keep in power within China. And so I think that COVID, that the reputation of China seriously damaged due to COVID, and there is a growing mistrust of China in Europe, in the United States. We see it in Australia. Maybe Gabriel should tell us something about the international investigation which Australia wants to launch, and at the same time, I'm observing the activity of India. I always tell the students, do not underestimate India, and with respect to climate and their capacity of taking initiative on modernization of their economy and transforming it into a non-carbon economy. And I think that India feels the opportunity, and they are inviting the investors to move from China to India, and they want to offer them some extra conditions, so that I think that Chinese leaders are increasingly worried that the country can be internationally isolated over its handling of the pandemic. And last but not least, Margaret Vestager, she's a European Union competition commissioner. She said last month that European countries should consider buying stakes in companies to protect them of the threat of Chinese takeovers. So it's like a puzzle. I'm putting these pieces together, and I think that China would really face a serious problem with respect to its authority. And this is what we, the supporters of Tibet, really need, because we know that a freedom to Tibet can come only by the time a serious changes within the Chinese Communist Party will appear, and this could be one of the momentum of these changes. So it's in line with my expectation that it will not take more than 10 years, and these changes will occur, and it will then also occur in Tibet. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. That's a brilliant summary of where we are, and I think you're absolutely right that China's leaders are increasingly worried by how the country is being perceived, and this crisis in trust and the shifting of global norms. And in response to that, they have launched a massive disinformation campaign in the last few months, using all sorts of covert and overt tactics to influence and to seek to rebuild their reputation.
Just an example from my country. The security office published a report which showed that at the beginning of the year, about 1,000 Chinese citizens were actively buying out the protection, the masks, out of drugstores, and they were. So there was, organized activity of hundreds of thousands, about 700,000 of these protective measures. So they delivered it to China because the pandemic appeared in China, was earlier there. They did not inform us, and later on, China provided us, the generous, help providing this. Later on, the citizens realized, and the journalists realized, that the Czech government paid tremendous money for that. The quality was really poor. So again, when every step the Chinese are doing, in fact, has been undermining its authority, and they are losing their supporters within this post-communist Czech Republic.
Okay, so we do have a couple of questions coming in, and perhaps this one is one for Gabriel, perhaps Martin as well. What can we learn from Tibetan roots and culture to deal with the lockdown in a positive way? And I would suggest that applies globally also, what Tibetans have taught us culturally about dealing with a lockdown of this kind. So we'll start off with that one.
Very, very interesting question. And to me, one of the things that motivates me to, keep working with Tibetans is that I find an enormous resilience, or another way of putting it is tremendous inner strengths that a lot of Tibetans have. And I don't just mean Tibetans who have, quite specific training in the traditional Tibetan methods of mind training. I think it's something that pervades the whole culture. And even Tibetans who don't think of themselves as religious or having any, deep immersion in those cultural traditions, nonetheless do know how to cooperate. They do know how not to let their emotions get completely out of hand. They do know how to maintain perspective. They do know how to deal with the sort of intense pressures. Katya earlier mentioned the Chinese government suddenly, out of the blue, in the immediate aftermath of the virus, suddenly insisting that in one very major prefecture, Ngawa, in eastern Tibet, that suddenly teaching in the Tibetan language, in the mother tongue, will no longer be allowed. You know, that one single stroke of what China sees as just another step in its assimilationist agenda of turning all minority nationalities into one nationality will certainly be resisted. Now, how can Tibetans resist without simply ending up in jail or, you know, even worse, tortured and sentenced to long periods in jail? If you think about it, in a remote prefecture like Ngawa, becoming a school teacher is one of the highest aspirations Tibetans can achieve. They are deeply respected by their fellow Tibetans. They are the most educated people. If you suddenly announce by decree that literally thousands of Tibetan teachers who, you know, got their degree, their tertiary qualification as Tibetan teachers from accredited universities on the promise that there is scope, there is space for Tibetan culture, for the mother tongue, for bilingual education. And suddenly all of those teachers, except for the few who are also fluent in Chinese as well, are suddenly redundant. I think China will rapidly discover that, you know, this is what they will in turn then frame as a security threat, because there are suddenly a whole lot of highly literate, highly educated, highly articulate Tibetans who do know Chinese law, Chinese policy, and will be able to do something effectively. So there is a collective strength, even under lockdown, even when you can't communicate, even when you are isolated, not just for a few painful weeks or a couple of months, but that becomes your new normal. The Chinese call this grid management. It really means fragmenting the whole of society into very small units, smaller than a Parisian arrondissement, smaller than, you know, a suburb, a rayon, and locking people down so tightly that, you know, you get a sense that you only have to think an unorthodox thought and somehow the state will know. And yet Tibetans know from experience how to deal with that, how to deal with the strong state, how to deal with the authoritarian impulse that insists that people have to obey, and if they are ungrateful, then they must be taught to obey. They must be instructed to obey, because this is a behavioral psychology that insists that if I can force you to repeat my ideology, my slogans over and over endlessly, you will eventually become those slogans. You will eventually start to believe them. Well, Tibetans have proven that that just doesn't work like that. If anything, you could say that Tibetan identity is now stronger than ever in reaction to China's racist, assimilationist arrogance.
That's also something that the Dalai Lama has often mentioned, that the spirit of, and when he was giving the March the 10th speeches for many years until he stopped doing that a few years ago when he devolved the political power. But I remember that the first paragraph of those speeches for many years was always about his pride in the strength of Tibetan resilience inside Tibet, and the ability of Tibetans, the continued ability of Tibetans inside Tibet to protect that, to hold their ground. We have another question here, which is for the panelists. Do you think this global attention or backlash against the CCP will promote some large-scale change in Tibet specifically? Could that change come from within China? Maybe I could ask all of the panelists, maybe Martin, because you referred to the global context. Maybe you might want to make a comment on that.
Yeah. Well, first of all, there was such an interesting answer of Gabriel. Really, I mean, the resilience and strength of Tibetans, it's so extraordinary. I myself, when I was just the only once in Tibet in March 1988, when, as Chinese wrote down in Golmud, Tibet is not closed, but it's unopened. So that time there was a martial law, and the Chinese Communist Army was showing their power. And I was admired by the visible behavior of the Tibetans on the street before the evening when they were locked down. They behaved like that, like there were no Chinese on the streets, like ignoring them with such a proud. This was something so strong, just to be silenced, just to be part of it. It's extraordinary. And then I should also add a solidarity. Our Buddhist teacher told us in autumn in Leh a story of a family which lost their son who self-immolated, and the people from a distance, more than 100 kilometers, sent tsampa to the house, and they literally filled the house with tsampa to help the family. So also these connections there are, and very strong. And with respect to a possible change in Tibet, well, I don't consider myself as an expert, but I think we can hardly expect any change without a change within the Communist Party itself. But my experience from my country, Czechoslovakia, is that, the fight of power inside inside the Communist Party is something which is delivering a change. And so what I'm expecting, is that there a certain wing within the party should be developed, mainly under the pressure of the global world, which will, from these reasons or a combination of the reasons, isolate China. I think that hardly any politician believe anymore that China is an opportunity, means economic opportunity. Remember the red carpet when Xi Jinping visited London about 5 years ago. I think that this is over, and that the politicians more understands China as a threat than the opportunity, really. And so I'm expecting these changes on a Chinese level, and then it will deliver the change in Tibet. And interesting what you, Gabriel, mentioned, that in fact you said that Chinese communists stupidly are creating the strong, intellectually based opposition within Tibet by the step they've just done. So yeah, and this is it.
Thank you. There's a few more questions. One of them is, does COVID present opportunities for the Tibet movement? And if so, how can we galvanize those? And so I suppose I'd frame that as a general question to all of you, what's your advice to supporters of Tibet and to Tibetan communities around the world at this current political moment in terms of these shifting relationships with China? What would be your advice? Would any of you like to speak to that?
I'm going to jump in here. I think that the experience of Italy, Spain, the UK, other countries is that when the virus first broke out in China, it seemed very far away. It seemed unique to China. It seemed somehow a story that didn't necessarily have a whole lot of relevance to the immediate circumstances that people lived in every day. And of course, that turned out to be a disastrous assumption. And I think we tend to assume that China is somehow completely different, has no relevance. And yet, if you look at the way in which the partnership of a strong state and big monopolistic high technology corporations in China all worked together to create the model of lockdown, of surveillance, of high technology control and monitoring of all of the movements and desires, wants of the people. I think we are increasingly discovering in Western countries that we are living in something really quite similar. We are much more complacent about the fact that every time we use Google or Facebook or Amazon, we are revealing to, a huge corporation not only where we are and what we are buying, but above all, our desires, our wants, our needs, our fantasies, the things that, we think maybe we would like to buy, not right away, but they are on our minds. We are revealing so much about ourselves, and we are now starting to discover that all of these huge monopoly corporations, whether they are in China or in the Western countries, are working increasingly closely with governments. They are increasingly coordinating the data, increasingly capable of identifying, who we are. And the Chinese system uses a term that they've used particularly in Xinjiang, where the Tibetan model was first scaled up and expanded on an enormous scale. They talk about predictive policing. This is the capacity for me, through technology, to watch everything you do, everything you say, every move you make online, so that I can predict in advance that you are starting to think, maybe not even consciously yet, of doing something that I think is bad, and therefore I will send the police to lock you up and subject you to indoctrination or whatever. Now, still, as soon as we say that, our immediate response is, oh, well, that doesn't happen in the Western countries. That's true. In Western countries, that there isn't a precise parallel, because in Western countries we rely much more on persuasion and behavioral economics and nudging people and hinting and suggesting and incentivizing people. But nonetheless, the strong state has come back in just about every Western country around the world, and they are increasingly close to the big technology companies. And as Naomi Wolf wrote the other day, Naomi Klein, sorry, they are the big technology companies in America, the names we all know, Facebook, Amazon, and Netflix, etc. They are increasingly demanding of the American government that the American government finance their research and development so that they can stay ahead of China. We often criticize China because the Chinese government finances, subsidizes, favors, privileges the big high technology corporations. These models are converging, even though we like to think that, we are not in any way like China. I think increasingly we are. And I think that means that there is an audience throughout the world who can understand that what is happening in Tibet is actually very relevant to their own lives.
Mm-hmm. Martin, did you want to comment on that?
I think this is very true. I have another argument which might be of a discussion, and that's what kind of lesson learned delivered COVID with respect to the globalization model, because the global economy is based on a transportation of this value chain, the parts from China and being produced in China, and all this is dependent, and one step of this chain is missing, and then it ruins up the business. And so for me, the question, a legitimate question, would be how we look on the existing globalization model, and if it's not getting kind of old, not too risky, and that a combination of the complications to launch the business in China and all the restrictions which there are, with the experience of pandemic, would not tempt the companies so that they changed the globalization model and they built their production landscape within a certain radius of kilometers around, so that it's more safe, and it's, let's say, hundreds of kilometers and not thousands overseas. And this could also make an important changes, because China is completely dependent on foreign trade. So this is also one legitimate question about the lessons learned for the people who are responsible for global business, if to change a behavior as a reaction to the COVID lessons learned.
I'm just saying, Dawa, Kasia, did you want to say something on that from your?
Yeah, well, no, what I would like to add is I think we have also to think, or I don't know, a lot about people in, if we take two countries like Nepal and India, which are more or less affected right now by the virus itself, as far as we know. But the main problem is the people. They will maybe not die from the virus, but from they don't have anything to eat. They don't have any work. You have millions of Indians who are in the street now and have nothing to eat, no job. And in Nepal, it's the same case with a lot of people. And it's something which I think we don't have to forget also as a consequence of this.
Mm-hmm. I wanted to also mention that the Tibetan writer in Beijing, Tsering, wrote a wonderful series, a cycle of poems about the virus, and I just wanted to read out one part of it, because she refers to this in her poem. She said, "Some are saving others' lives, some pray to their own gods, some people continue doing evil, greater evil. No place exists that will not fall to the enemy. No epidemic exists that is not terrifying. No, there exists a plague far worse than this one. The official declaration of 0 new infections is suspicious. A political Shangri-La does not exist, but repeating something 100 times will cover the truth. So she's talking about a political plague, a plague of tyranny that she describes as being far worse than the virus in Tibet. So we still have a couple of questions, but Dawa, are you saying we're out of time for that? There was one question here that I just wanted to make a comment on. Why do you think Western politicians are not so strong to investigate on the virus and where it comes from? Well, I would say to that there's a global war of narratives around this virus, and we can see particularly the war of words between the US and China on the origins of the virus. In Wuhan, China has sought to, after imposing a dramatic draconian lockdown, after isolating people, after silencing whistleblowers and covering up the virus, immediately China sought to launch a very aggressive information war, and at one point even blaming America for causing the virus. Specifically a sort of a military meeting of a visit of US military officials to Wuhan last year. So, and of course America has hit back at that. And so China has used a whole range, a whole arsenal of covert and overt tools in which to seek to establish its dominance and to regain dominance, exactly as the US, the world's superpower, falters in its environment. It's done this through numerous means, through providing aid, masks, equipment to different countries, as Martin talked about in the Czech Republic, and to Italy and numerous other countries in Europe, also with the aim of sowing seeds of disunity and division within European countries too. So, and to pick up on what Gabriel's point now is that I think that we see at this point in the world that what Tibetans have to teach us is more relevant than it ever has been before, perhaps. And what happens in Tibet now matters to all of us. Their experience can teach all of us in so many different ways. I'm just checking if we have any more questions, or Dawa, are you saying we're okay. Out of time?
No, we have a time. Yeah, for a few more questions.
Okay. There's one question here which is okay. There's a question actually about Falun Gong practitioners and Tibetan political prisoners are subject to organ harvesting. How do doctors from around the world speak about this? That's a question that's a little bit off topic, but I'd refer that questioner to the tribunal on organ transplantation, which happened in London last year, in which evidence of mass organ harvesting from Falun Gong practitioners and indicators that this trade has moved to using Uyghurs and raising questions about the fate of Uyghur prisoners in camps across the world. So far, there's very little hard data on this affecting Tibetan political prisoners. Okay, I don't know if there's any other questions that I've missed along the way, or if there's any further comments from the panel about this issue as a whole. I mean, there's
Just a very short comment as a kind of feedback to the last question concerning organ harvesting. It's already, I think, more than 10 years ago when I was still member of a parliament, and we invited David Kilgour, the Canadian politician, and Ethan Goodman, who wrote the book, and this became a political issue. And recently, the upper chamber of the parliament, the Senate, raised the issue and set up the investigative committee. So this is an issue over here. It's good that even in a small country like Czech Republic, the politicians are aware of this and are trying to help to open up this issue.
It's long overdue, I think, because it's been of such tremendous scope and scale over the years, with very little being known about it for so long. And it was not taken seriously for many years until scientists, doctors, and there is a doctors group who are working on this, and a lot of evidence and data. And in many ways, the campaign to eliminate Falun Gong, which was promoted by Jiang Zemin and carried out with such ferocity, predated the ethnic unity policies that we now see, the ethnic assimilation policies that we now see in Tibetan and Uyghur areas. We have one comment that's just come in about 5G on Mount Everest, and I don't know if others watching this saw the videos of the 5G masts being carried up Mount Everest by yaks. These footage emerged last week, and there has been a lot of conspiracy theories circulating about 5G and coronavirus. Here in the UK, a number of 5G masts have been burnt because of those conspiracy theories circulating, which are fake news, of course. But still, I don't know if Gabriel or Katja, you'd like to comment at all on the 5G infrastructure, the surveillance infrastructure in Tibet, and now the imposition of 5G as well.
Katja.
But you can, but as far as Everest is concerned, we can add also that on the Chinese side, they want now to have the wall Chomolungma, the wall Everest in China, and no more in Nepal for the south side. So if they put the 5G, they can put in all Everest, since they decided that it belonged to China. And yes, I think it's a problem also, of course. But I'm not a specialist of 5G, so maybe Gabriel can add more on that.
Well, I think Katja is quite right that China is out to claim all sacred mountains, all pilgrimage sites, all holy lakes, all parts of Tibet, including the entire Himalayas, to be inherently Chinese and having been Chinese for thousands of years, etc. But the world has been speeding up, and 5G is really central to the accelerating pace of the world. Martin Bursik very helpfully reminded us that over the last couple of months, we took a pause. We actually slowed down. We slowed our pollution. We slowed our lives. We rediscovered human connections. We rediscovered who we really love and who loves us and what really matters in the world. But now all governments are desperately keen to speed everything up again, as if the economy is somehow completely separate from society, And I think that's one of the deepest understandings that we can learn from Tibetans, that society and economy are not two completely separate realms. And in the virus situation, it's society versus the economy, and ultimately the economy must prevail. None of this can happen unless the world moves really fast, and 5G is very central to that capacity for big data not only to be collected, but to be collected in real time and analysed by algorithms in real time, not by human intelligence, but by equations. And that's what enables governments to talk about developing a capacity for predictive policing. We can lock you up before you are even consciously aware that you are starting to think about doing something that I, the central authority, define as criminal. So 5G accelerates a trend that it has been growing for years. We took a pause. Now 5G promises to do what the epidemiologists have also done. This is the first plague, the first pandemic, the first mass infection in human history that anybody has thought it was possible to control in real time as it happened. Every other pandemic in history happened and worked its way out naturally, just fizzled out because of a change in the seasons, or the majority of the population attained immunity, or whatever. And gradually, over many, many years, we learned lessons. Sometimes we learned really useful lessons. Sometimes we learned quite selfish lessons about the need for competitive nationalism and to shut everybody out and to shut strangers out and blame immigrants and so on. But whatever the lessons we learned lessons. But this pandemic, there is the conviction amongst the scientists that we now have the capacity, thanks to big data surveillance and collection and the algorithms and instant analysis of trends and models and what direction we're going, to try and control this pandemic as it happens. That is what is historically unique. Whether that turns out to be a legitimate hope or expectation, I don't think we know yet. But it is the same insistence on gathering enormous amounts of data on everyone and anyone, who we are, where we are, what we're doing, what we desire, what we dream. 5G is part of that. And I do think that Tibetans will and can have a lot to contribute to that debate about how the world is accelerating. The cities are getting more dense, which means viruses are transmitted much more easily. Tibetans have always valued spaciousness and solitude, which are very old-fashioned virtues that the modern world has forgotten about. And maybe in the last couple of months we just had a glimpse of how virtuous those old virtues actually are. And maybe we're at a turning point now where we do need to consider whether not only the reduced pollution that Martin talked about is actually something really worthwhile, but so too is the return to our roots, return to home, get used to solitude and not having constant reminders of how many thousands of friends we've got on Facebook. And I think Tibetans definitely have a role to play in all of those debates.
That's very true. Thank you, Gabriel. Very true. I'd like to ask something relating to what we discussed about the origin of the virus. because we know that it's most likely that it came from wet market in Wuhan, and a sort of zootropic transmission from animal to human. That seems the most likely according to the information we have so far. And I'm just wondering if that has any implications for the issue of wildlife trafficking, the issue, China has already said that it's going to tighten up on wildlife trafficking, which is obviously a good thing if it happens, if it's implemented. But I'm wondering if Gabriel could make a comment about the issue of the national parks across Tibet, because Tibet is being completely transformed. China has said that it's setting up these massive national parks across the plateau, across the Earth's third pole, which obviously are contingent upon the relocation of Tibetans and the removal of Tibetan nomads from that land. And I just wondered, Gabriel, if you could make a short comment about that.
Well, that's a big topic, so I will try.
Yeah. Short comments is difficult.
I'll just look at
You have a
one
eloquently
aspect. I'll just focus on one aspect of biodiversity in Tibet. There is a lot of wildlife in Tibet. China has never known much about it, cared much about it. When Tibetan antelopes were being slaughtered in huge amounts just for their musk glands or for a tiny amount of fur on their underbellies, for decades, Tibetans were willing to risk their lives to protect the antelopes, while China really, didn't care very much. But China has now discovered biodiversity, and yet at the same time, there are pandemics, there are plagues, there are transmissions of disease across species, from wild animals to domestic animals, and from domestic animals to humans, Tibetan humans. That happen all the time in Tibet. Chinese scientists have studied it, but who has done anything effective about educating Tibetan nomads about how to manage those zoonotic transmissions of infections that lead to extremely nasty diseases, nasty ways to die when parasites that live in the wildlife are transmitted to sheep or goats or yaks, and then from them into people. I'm talking about diseases like echinococcosis, hydatids, the hydatids parasite. Any scientist, and certainly these days any epidemiologist, knows all about this. There's been a huge amount of Chinese scientific research into this, but no education program to effectively block those species-to-species transmissions that cause so many Tibetans to die really painful and unpleasant deaths. So I'm sorry to finish on a downbeat, but that's just one example of the problems that we face.
We have one more question, which maybe has to be our last Dawa. I think Dawa's nodding, aren't you? So this question is one of the impacts of the crisis is the financial pressure on NGO sectors. And the Tibet movement will not be shielded from this. How does this force the approach of worldwide Tibet movement to work more closely together to avoid duplication and hopefully find better ways of becoming more effective? So that's a very practical question there about the challenges facing the Tibetan movement in exile. I wonder which speaker would like to pick that up.
I think, Kate, you can answer that one very well yourself.
Well, I was thinking more in terms of Martin, as in terms of with the Czech Tibet support work that you've been doing. If you want to make a comment on that.
I'm sorry, I was having some problem with the connection. I didn't get the question. The question is about the influence on financing the Tibetan
It was about
organizations.
really the impact of the crisis on the worldwide Tibet movement, and how people can work more closely together, not duplicating work, and finding more ways of becoming effective. So it's a more practical variation of the question we talked about before, about advice to supporters about the direction, and to communities in exile, and the financial pressures that will be on everybody.
Well, you know, there are many pro-Tibetan organizations, and you know that my long-term intention, because I'm half environmentalist and half human rights activist, which got in love with the Tibetan people. I think that so far different pro-Tibetan NGOs are concentrated on different issues, and that's true. Some are active in the areas of North India where Tibetan refugee communities strong, and some are concentrating on environment. So, and you know about my long-term intention to enforce this movement with the environmentalists, the environmental NGOs. These are two kind of separate groups of activists where I think that this kind of events should put these groups together and make them stronger together. And I think that the issue of coronavirus and the lesson for all the world, in fact, will help to unify and to strengthen the cooperation, because there is one very strong topic, and which the people understand. Nevertheless, they live and are active in a north or south or east or west, and I think it also has helped us to understand better and a much more urgent way the Chinese system. And I think that one of the lessons learned was Chernobyl. All of us are, or mostly all of us, are remembering Chernobyl and how Russian Soviets were hiding the information, and then the influence up into large part of the world. This is even wider. This is global, and so I think we have a very strong common issue, and which touched not just activists around the world, but it touched all the governments, all the politicians, which now should very carefully handle the issue of the role of China in the future. So I think that it's a kind of paradox that the coronavirus event or a pandemic, in fact, in my eyes, is going to strengthen the resistant movement and the non-governmental organizations which work in favor of freedom of Tibetans.
Thank you. I think, as Gabriel invited me to make a comment, I'll also make a comment on that one. And I agree with you, Martin. I agree. I think we have to understand China. We have to understand China's policies in Tibet in a deeper way than before. We have to make more efforts to understand those. And we have to learn from Tibetans too, as Gabriel has so eloquently spoken about. And that includes learning from the Dalai Lama, of course. And my late boss, Gyari Rinpoche, used to say that when he was leading the dialogue process and he was on those missions inside the PRC and inside Tibet, Tibetans used to say to him one phrase, which was, listen to him. And what they meant was, listen to the Dalai Lama. And they didn't need to say his name, of course, but I think that the Dalai Lama has long been asking us to look at the environment, to look at culture, to look at language, to look at the core issues facing Tibetans today. He's pioneered the influencing of Chinese people and outreach to Chinese people, outreach to Chinese Buddhists in a broader and deeper effort to help Chinese to understand what is of value in the Tibetan culture. And also I would suggest that China is engaged in a mighty exercise to seek to erase Tibet, to erase conversation about Tibet, to marginalize Tibet on the global stage. And so it's even more important right now for all of Tibet supporters, Tibetan communities, to make sure that doesn't happen, and that the channels are clear for us to learn from Tibetans, from Tibetan culture, and to understand it much more. So I think we have run out of time now. Is that right, Dawa? I can see you.
We can go for one final question, if you got.
Okay, I'm not sure if we've got one final question. Just seeing if have I missed any questions, Dawa? Do you know? I don't think I have.
Did they manage to send all the questions? Yeah.
Any more?
They've sent all the questions, I think.
Yes. Okay. All right. Well, I would like to conclude by thanking everybody, and it's the pandemic has given this opportunity, this rare opportunity to bring us together in ways that we would never have imagined before, perhaps. So Gabriel there in Australia, and Martin in Prague, and Katja in Paris, and us in London. And I hope these conversations can continue, because I found that there was much food for thought there, a lot of thought-provoking answers, questions, lots of wisdom, and lots of reflection. So, and I think, Dawa, this will be available as a recording afterwards, won't it? Yes. Yeah. So thank you to Katja, to Martin, to Gabriel. And I'm going to hand over to Dawa, because I believe you're going to sum up and to conclude.
Okay. Thank you very much, Kate. It's been a wonderful discussion, and very inspiring and very informative. It's always interesting to listen from experts, and I will certainly going to watch it again. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. And first of all, like I really, on behalf of a Tibetan community in Britain, I'd like to express our gratitude and appreciation for all the experts for sharing your knowledge, wisdom, and your time at this particular juncture. Thank you so much for your joining the discuss. It's been very, very helpful for us. And I believe our Tibetan brothers and sisters, they will learn from this. And we're going to keep this. This is recorded. It will remain in our Facebook page. They can watch again and again. And there was two comments I'd like to make was, what world can learn from Tibet? There are many things world can learn from Tibet. But right now, the first thing what world can learn from Tibet is, for more than 6 decades, Tibet has been saying to the world, you can't trust Chinese regime, you can't trust Chinese regime. Now, hopefully, this is the time the world will learn that they can't trust the Chinese regime because of this pandemic experience. Whole world is suffering. That's one thing. And other thing for us is you mentioned about the impact in Tibetan refugees because of this. of course, Tibetan refugees for the last 6 decades, we've been suffering just like world. And right now, when the world is suffering, we are suffering. And we face the challenges. Our elders, they face the challenges. We are facing the challenges. And because of this pandemic, what happened is like Tibetan refugees are well looked after by Central Tibetan administration. And then there were a few cases where Tibetans all over the world, they started helping, contributing money for the needy who needs help as they are locked down. So that was a good point. And there was other a beautiful incident, like we have lots of like healthcare workers. Now it's all over in America, Toronto, England, Tibetan nurses, doctors, and they are properly practicing compassion and responsibility full-time, looking after COVID-19 patients. So that's again beautiful that Tibetans can do to contribute. So these are the two I like to mention. And then I like to send a message to TCB members and Tibetans watching from everywhere. I like to shout out is like wherever you are, there will be a Chinese embassies. And for us, this is the time. Don't miss. Time for action. Don't miss it. Stay safe. And finally, I'd like to express my love and prayers for His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama, for his good health and for fulfill his all wishes. And then once again, thank you very much for all four of you. Kate, Patia, Gabriel, Martin, thank you so much for your time. And it's goodbye from London. And thank you for watching.